The wind clawed at the canyon walls like a wounded beast, howling through the jagged stone as if the earth itself mourned. It carried with it the scent of smoke, sweat, and blood. Twisting through the narrow pass where Mara stood frozen, her back pressed against the rough sandstone. The moon broke through torn clouds, silvering the Apache warrior's face as he leaned close, his breath warm against her ear, his words shattering her world. I cannot love you more. It's enough now. Love will be no any more. The syllables fell heavy, raw and final, as if ripped from his very bones. For a moment, Mara thought she had misheard. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning the desert silence, and yet his tone carried no mistake. Her fingers trembled as they pressed against the rough leather strap that crossed his bare chest, desperate to keep him near, desperate to tether him to the fragile thread of something she hadn't even dared name. She searched his obsidian-dark eyes, but they were unreadable like the stars scattered cold and distant overhead. Maka. She whispered his name, her voice breaking. Why would you say this now? Beyond them, the desert night stirred with menace. Horses stamped the dirt impatiently. Somewhere in the distance, rifles clicked as men prepared for war. Shadows moved along the canyon ridge, shifting like restless ghosts. Every sound seemed sharper, more dangerous, the grind of stone beneath boots, the rattle of spurs, the hollow whisper of a bowstring being drawn back. He pulled back slightly, his jaw set hard as carved stone. Because if I stay, you will die. His words, though steady, carried a tremor only she could hear. They are coming, Mara, and they will not stop until they burn everything. Her stomach tightened. She thought of her father's ranch, its weathered barns, the corral fence leaning tired against the prairie wind, the cottonwood tree where her husband, now years dead, had carved their initials. She thought of the cattle driven off in the drought, the nights spent staring at cracked soil praying for rain. But all of it the land, the past. The grief seemed like ashes compared to the fire this man had lit inside her. Mara was 30 years old, hardened by loss, tempered by survival. She had buried a husband, fought off creditors, and clawed her way through years of loneliness, but nothing in all her battles had ever threatened to undo her like this moment. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she would rather face death beside him than live with the hollow echo of his absence. Instead, her throat locked tight. She could only shake her head, a single tear streaking down her dirt-stained cheek. "Don't you dare," she whispered, the words fragile as glass. He reached up, cupping her face in his calloused palm. His touch was both tender and fierce, like the desert sun at dawn, merciless yet life-giving. His thumb brushed the tear from her cheek, and for an instant his mask slipped. She saw it. The war inside him, the pull between duty and desire, the ache that mirrored her own. "I swore an oath to my people," he said softly, his voice rough with anguish. "The bluecoats march this way. They will not spare a woman who carries the mark of a warrior's love." His gaze flicked to the red, beaded necklace that lay against her throat, the one he had placed there in secret weeks before, a gift, a claim, a dangerous symbol. Mara's hand flew to it, clutching the beads as though they were her own heartbeat. She remembered the night he had given it to her, beneath the cottonwood where shadows danced in the lamplight. He had said nothing then, only tied it gently around her neck, but in that silence, she had heard everything. Now it was a brand, a reason for men to kill her. Her breath shook as she spoke. "So what? I should hide? Pretend it meant nothing? You think I can scrape you out of my heart as if you were dust on my boots?" His expression tightened, pain flickering across his face like firelight. The wind gusted hard, carrying the distant thunder of hooves closer now. Time was running out. "I will leave," Maka said, his voice a low vow. "And when I do, they will look at you and see only a widow clinging to a dying farm. They will not see me in your eyes. They will not taste me in your breath. They will not know." Her chest constricted, each word like a blade twisting inside her. He was trying to erase himself, to carve out the truth that had bound them in stolen hours and secret glances. But she knew, whether he stayed or vanished, his shadow would linger in every heartbeat, every breath, every sunrise over the red cliffs. The sound of horses swelled, louder now, echoing through the canyon. Men were coming, torches flaring like sparks of hellfire. Mara's grip on his strap tightened. "If you walk away from me now, Maka, you won't just kill this love. You'll kill me too." His eyes blazed, storm and sorrow colliding. For a heartbeat, she thought he might yield. But then he leaned close again, his lips brushing her temple in a kiss that seared more than soothed. "You must live," he whispered, "even if it means I do not." And before she could speak, before she could claw him back, he pulled away into the darkness. Mara stood rooted to the canyon wall long after Maka vanished into the shadows, her chest heaving as though the desert air itself refused to enter her lungs. The echo of his whisper clung to her like smoke, bitter and inescapable. The torches grew brighter. Voices carried through the night, gruff, harsh, English words twisted with hatred. Soldiers. She could hear the clink of spurs, the thud of boots, the iron rattle of rifles against saddles. Maka hadn't been lying. Death was moving closer, but Mara wasn't afraid. Not of them. Not compared to the hollow tearing at her chest. She pulled the beaded necklace free from her throat and clenched it in her fist until the edges dug into her palm. He had tried to erase himself, but he was everywhere, and the smell of leather still on her fingers, in the warmth lingering where his hand had cupped her cheek, in the silence between her pounding heartbeats. And then, with a sound like thunder breaking, a shot split the canyon. The soldiers had spotted movement farther down the pass. A horse screamed, hooves scattering stone. Mara ducked instinctively, pressing herself flat against the wall, the rifle crack bouncing from cliff to cliff. Sparks of torchlight painted the rock in violent flashes. Maka was out there, somewhere beyond the chaos. "Hold the line." A voice barked. "No Apache slips through tonight." Mara's breath froze. They were hunting him. He had left her behind to save her, but he had only made himself the bait. Rage kindled in her chest, hot and fierce, cutting through the grief like a blade. She would not let him be slaughtered alone. She dropped low, skirts brushing the dust, and edged along the rock face, keeping to the shadows. Her heart hammered with every step, each one a silent vow. If they thought she would cower and let them murder him, they had never known the measure of Mara Callahan. The canyon narrowed, funneling the soldiers forward. Torchlight flickered across their faces. Hard men, weary men, their blue coats smeared with desert dirt. Mara recognized one of them, Corporal Henson. He had come to her father's ranch once, demanding cattle for military need, leaving only threats when she refused. His laugh, sharp as a saw blade, carried over the rocks. "If the savage shows his face, gut him. Don't waste a bullet." Mara's nails bit into her palms. She slid behind a boulder, eyes straining in the dark, searching for him. Searching for the glint of obsidian hair, for the shape she knew as surely as her own breath. And then she saw him. Maka crouched high on the canyon ridge, a shadow among shadows, bow drawn taut, the muscles of his arms gleaming in the moonlight. He was magnificent, every line of him cut by discipline and defiance. But Mara knew the numbers. There were too many soldiers. For every arrow he loosed, 5 rifles waited. Her heart surged to her throat. He couldn't win this. Not alone. A thought, reckless and sharp, burst inside her. But he doesn't have to be alone. Mara darted back, skirts tangling in her legs, scrambling for the pack she had hidden behind a rock earlier that day. Inside her father's revolver. Heavy worn but loaded. Her hands shook as she gripped it, the familiar weight biting into her palm. She had sworn never to pick it up again after burying her husband. But vows meant nothing in the face of love. The canyon rang with another shot. Maka's arrow struck true, dropping a soldier with a cry that echoed into silence. Chaos erupted: shouts, scrambling boots, rifles snapping upward. Torches flared wildly as men turned their aim toward the ridge. Mara raised the revolver. The grip was slick with sweat, the metal cold as night. She drew in a breath, steadying her hands. Her eyes locked not on the soldiers but on the warrior above, shirtless, painted by moonlight, long hair whipping in the desert wind. If he falls, I fall too, she thought. The first soldier's rifle fired. Mara squeezed the trigger. The crack tore her ears, the recoil biting into her wrist. A soldier dropped. Confusion rippled through their ranks as they whipped around. Shouting, someone else was shooting. Maka's eyes found hers across the chaos. Even from this distance, she felt it, the jolt of recognition, the fury that she was there, and the flicker of something deeper. He hadn't wanted her in this fight, but here she was. Another bullet screamed past. Dust exploded near her face. Mara ducked, the revolver trembling in her grip, her pulse hammering in her skull. For a heartbeat, terror clawed at her throat. But then she heard Maka's voice in her memory. You must live, she gritted her teeth. Not without you. Rising again, she leveled the revolver, her hair wild in the torchlight, her eyes blazing as she fired into the storm. The canyon was no longer a trap. It was a battleground, and she would not let him face it alone. Smoke curled low in the canyon as the echoes of gunfire faded into silence. The acrid stench of powder clung to Mara's throat, making each breath burn. She crouched behind the boulder, revolver still trembling in her grip, her ears ringing. When the last torch sputtered out on the canyon floor, she dared to lift her head. Bodies sprawled in the dirt below, blue coats twisted in unnatural shapes, rifles lying useless in the dust. Horses had scattered into the darkness, their terrified cries swallowed by the wind. But she could not count them, nor did she care. Her eyes sought only one figure. High above, against the fading moonlight, stood Maka. His bow dangled at his side, the string frayed, an arrow still clenched in his fist. His chest heaved with the rhythm of battle, sweat gleaming against the muscles of his bare shoulders. His long black hair wild in the night wind. For a heartbeat, he seemed carved from stone, untouchable, untamed. Then his gaze dropped to her. Their eyes locked, and in that moment Mara felt the earth tilt beneath her. They had fought together. The line he had drawn, the whisper of finality he had given her, she had shattered it with a single pull of the trigger. And he knew it, but there was no time to speak. A soldier groaned on the ground, dragging himself toward his rifle. Maka's hand moved like lightning, the arrow flashing through the night, silencing him. The sound of it cut through Mara's bones sharp, final. Then the warrior leapt down the ridge, his body moving with a predator's grace, landing in a crouch before he rose to face her. You should not have fired, he said. Voice low, strained with anger. Mara gritted her teeth, clutching the revolver tight. And you should not have left me. The silence between them stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Dust swirled around their feet, glowing faintly in the dying torchlight. Maka's jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling like the rhythm of a storm barely contained. More will come, he said at last, his tone heavy. This was only their teeth. The rest will bite harder. Mara lifted her chin. Then we run. For the first time that night, a flicker of surprise passed over his face. He studied her as if seeing her not as the fragile ranch widow he had once believed her to be, but as something forged from fire and grit. A woman who had chosen to stand against soldiers armed with nothing but 6 bullets and stubbornness. Run where? He asked, his voice soft but sharp. The ranch is already cursed, she said bitterly. There's nothing left there but dust and ghosts. But I know the land. I know the rivers, the gullies, the caves. You said they hunt you, then let them hunt us both. I won't hide while you bleed alone. Something broke in his expression then, though he masked it quickly. He reached for her wrist, his grip firm but not cruel, guiding the revolver from her trembling hand. His fingers lingered for the briefest moment against her skin before he slid the weapon into his own belt. You are stubborn, he murmured. Like the earth after rain, it will not move, no matter how the river strikes. Then quit striking it, Mara shot back, her voice fierce though her heart hammered. A strange silence fell between them. No anger, no denial. Only the raw truth of two souls too entangled to be cut apart by whispers or war. The night pressed closer. The wind carried distant sounds, men shouting, horses being rallied. The soldiers were regrouping. Maka's head turned sharply, his senses keener than hers. He touched her arm, urging her forward. Come, he said. If we stay, we die. They moved quickly through the canyon, feet silent against the stone. Mara stumbled once on loose rock, but Maka caught her before she fell, his hand steady at her back. For a moment she leaned into his strength, feeling the heat of his body, the steady pulse of his heart. Then he released her, his gaze already on the dark horizon dot at the canyon's mouth. The desert opened wide, an ocean of shadows beneath the stars. Mara felt both awe and dread. The land stretched endless, unforgiving, a place where men vanished like smoke. Where will we go? She whispered. May pointed east, toward the jagged silhouettes of distant cliffs. There is a cave where the soldiers do not tread. We will rest there until the sun rises. After that, his voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken truths. After that? She pressed. His eyes softened, just for her. After that, you must choose if you will carry my shadow forever, or set it down before it consumes you. The words chilled her. Even as his hand brushed against hers, rough and fleeting. Mara lifted her face to the desert wind. I already chose. Maka. The moment I fired that gun, the night swallowed them as they walked into the wilderness. Side by side, hunted yet unbroken, bound by something deeper than fear. The desert swallowed them whole. Hour after hour, Mara and Maka pressed eastward, the sand whispering beneath their feet, the stars watching like 1,000 silent eyes. The night air grew colder, biting through the sweat on her skin, yet every step with him burned hotter than fire. At last, as dawn's pale fingers reached across the horizon, Maka slowed. He raised a hand, listening, his head cocked slightly toward the breeze. Mara froze, her lungs burning, straining to hear what he did. Nothing but silence, the kind that prickled the skin, making the hair on her arms rise. They are close, he murmured, his voice low as the wind. We must vanish. He guided her toward a cluster of jagged cliffs. Hidden between them lay a narrow fissure in the rock, dark and uninviting. Mara's breath caught as she stepped inside. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of earth and stone. Shadows clung to the walls, broken only by a faint glimmer of light seeping through cracks above. It was a cave type. Hidden, the kind of place where silence grew heavy and secrets lingered. Maka moved first, checking the corners, his steps silent as a predator. Mara followed, pressing her hand against the damp wall to steady herself. When he finally stopped, lowering himself onto a flat rock, exhaustion slipped through his posture. His chest rose and fell heavily, sweat gleaming across his skin, his long black hair clinging to his shoulders. Mara sank down across from him, drawing her knees close. For a long moment, neither spoke. The quiet wasn't empty. It was thick with everything unsaid, everything fought for, everything nearly lost. At last, Mara broke it. You meant it, didn't you? When you whispered that love was over. Maka's head lifted, his eyes catching the faint light. They were softer now, stripped of the steel he wore in battle. I meant what I had to. Her throat tightened. And what about what you want? His gaze lingered on her, unflinching, but his silence answered for him. The war inside him was written plain across his face. Duty, desire, a path carved long before her and another carved the moment she had. Pull that trigger. Mara pressed on, her voice raw. You think you're protecting me, but I've buried a husband. I've buried dreams. Do you think losing you will hurt less because you walked away first? It will break me, Maka, worse than any bullet. His jaw flexed. For a moment, she thought he might argue. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice dropped to a whisper, rough and aching. When I was a boy, soldiers burned my village. My mother's necklace was torn from her throat before they cut her down. My people gave me a name, Maka, Earth, because they said I had to stand as solid as stone. No weakness. No softness. If I allow myself to want you, they will tear you apart to break me. The confession hit Mara like a blow. She had never heard him speak of his past, never seen him peel back the mask he wore so fiercely. Her chest ached with the weight of it, with the truth of a man who had carried fire and lost his whole life. Quietly, she reached across the shadows and touched his hand. His skin was warm, rough, trembling faintly beneath her fingertips. Then let them come, she said softly. I will not be torn apart. Not by them. Not by you. For the first time, he didn't pull away. His fingers curled around hers, strong yet unsure, as if holding her meant stepping across a line he could never retreat from. The cave seemed to hold its breath. Outside, a hawk cried, the sound sharp against the morning air. Maka's head lifted, every muscle in his body alert. He released her hand and moved to the cave mouth, peering into the pale dawn. Mara's heart lurched at the sudden loss of his touch. What is it? She whispered. He crouched low, his shoulders taut. Tracks, horses. They will find us by midday. Her pulse quickened. The fragile safety of the cave shattered in an instant. She rose to her feet, gripping her skirts, her eyes locked on his. Then we fight together. Or we run. But I will not hide while you bleed. Maka turned, his expression fierce yet shadowed with something deeper, a flicker of pride, of sorrow, of a love he could no longer deny. Then stay at my side, he said. His voice was no longer a whisper of goodbye. It was a vow dot, and in that dim cave, with sunlight just breaking across the cliffs, Mara felt the line between them shift forever. The sky over the canyon darkened as if the earth itself held its breath. Kael stood on the ridge, his tall figure outlined against a rolling wall of thunderclouds. His long black hair whipped across his face, yet his stance never wavered. He was shirtless, the copper of his skin gleaming under flashes of lightning. The turquoise beads and bone carvings of his tribal jewelry caught glimmers of the storm, giving him the appearance of a spirit born from both earth and sky. Kael's sharp eyes scanned the horizon. He knew the storm was not just of nature. Too many signs had warned him. The restless behavior of the horses, the hawks circling low, and the whispering voices in his dreams. The elders had once spoken of storms that carried omens winds that could strip away not only branches and dust, but the fates of men dot behind him. Sarah stood close, her face pale in the gathering gloom. She wrapped her shawl tighter, though Kael knew it was not the cold she feared. Ever since he had saved her from the ambush weeks before, she had followed his path with a loyalty that surprised him. Yet he saw the questions in her eyes, questions she hadn't yet dared to ask. Kael, she finally spoke, her voice soft, nearly stolen by the wind. Do you think they'll come tonight? He turned to her slowly, his jaw tightening. They are already here. Almost on cue, a distant war cry split through the storm. Sarah flinched, her hand reaching instinctively for Kael's arm. He didn't move, only narrowed his eyes toward the canyon floor where faint figures began to emerge from the shadows. Torches flickered against the wind, carried by riders whose numbers grew by the moment. Kael knew them well. They were outcasts, men who had betrayed their own tribes for the greed of settlers and the lure of silver. Painted in stolen colors, they rode like wolves with no loyalty, no code. Their leader, a broad man with a scar crossing his cheek, raised his spear high and shouted. The echoes bounced off the canyon walls like 100 voices instead of one. Sarah's grip on Kael's arm tightened. "What do we do?" she whispered, fear rising in her tone. Kael finally looked at her, his dark gaze steady. "We stand." He led her back toward a cluster of rocks where their horses were tied. The storm-intensified rain began to lash down in sheets, lightning cracking across the sky. Kael untied his warhorse, a powerful black stallion with eyes just as fierce as its master's. He pressed his forehead briefly to the horses, whispering words in Apache tongue. Words of strength and brotherhood. Sarah watched, torn between awe and terror. She had seen Kael in battle before, but something about tonight felt different. His presence carried a gravity she couldn't explain, as though the storm itself obeyed him. Kael mounted his stallion with fluid ease, his long hair plastered against his chest and shoulders by the rain. He turned to Sarah, extending a hand to her. She hesitated only a second before grasping it, pulling herself onto the horse behind him. Her arms wrapped around his waist, clinging to his solid frame as thunder rolled overhead. The outcasts were closer now. Their cries pierced the storm, their torches a river of fire moving against the wind. Kael lifted his spear, the carved feathers tied below its tip fluttering violently. His voice rose in a deep, resonant cry, a call older than the canyon itself. The sound made Sarah's heart pound. It was both terrifying and beautiful, like the voice of the storm embodied in a man. The enemy faltered for a heartbeat at the sound. Kael urged his stallion forward, and the ground trembled beneath them. Rain-blinded, wind howled, but Kael rode like lightning itself. His spear met the first rider, striking with such force the man fell instantly. Sarah cried out but held on, her fear drowned by the sheer will that radiated from Kael. The canyon became chaos, hooves pounding, spears clashing, lightning splitting the night. Yet in the storm, Kael was untouchable. His muscles rippled with every strike, his long hair a wild banner of defiance. To Sarah, it was as though the storm had chosen him, made him its warrior. As more enemies closed in, Kael's cry rose again, carrying through the thunder. Sarah realized then that no matter how many came, Kael would never surrender. He was not merely fighting for himself or for her, he was fighting for the land, for the spirits of his people, for every story carved into the rocks of the canyon. And as the storm raged on, Kael became more than a man. He became legend. The canyon smelled of rain and blood. The storm had broken into fragments, its fury spent in waves of thunder, but the battle it cloaked left scars across the land. Kael sat astride his black stallion, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a man who had given everything yet refused to yield. His spear was cracked, streaked with red, and his long black hair clung to his shoulders in wet strands. Sarah clung to him still, her cheek pressed against his back, trembling though she tried not to let him feel it. She had never seen a man fight like that, not as a beast, not as a savage, but as though the spirits themselves had entered his veins. To her, Kael no longer seemed mortal, but even legends bleed. As Kael guided the stallion toward a rocky overhang for shelter, Sarah noticed the dark smear along his side. "Kael," she whispered urgently, her voice breaking. "You're hurt." He did not look down. His jaw was set like stone. "It is nothing," but when he dismounted, his knees nearly buckled. Sarah slid down quickly, catching his arm though her strength was nothing compared to his. She felt the heat of his skin under her hand, hotter than the storm, hotter than the fire still burning in the canyon below. "You'll die if you don't let me help you," she said, her tone sharper now, the fear behind it like glass. Kael's dark eyes found hers. For a moment, she thought he might push her away, as he had done with his words so many times before. But something in him faltered just for a heartbeat. He nodded once. They dragged themselves beneath the rocky overhang where the rain could not reach. Sarah knelt before him, tearing strips from her own shawl to bind the gash in his side. Her hands shook as she worked, not from the cold but from the nearness of him. The copper of his skin gleamed with both rain and blood, every muscle sculpted as though by the storm itself. She dared not let her eyes linger, though her heart betrayed her with every beat. Kael watched her silently. His gaze was heavy, unreadable, but it softened when he saw the smudges of dirt on her cheeks. The damp strands of hair stuck to her forehead. She was not born of his people, not shaped by the desert winds or the old songs of the canyon. Yet she knelt before him with fire in her spirit, unbroken by the night's terror. When she finished binding him, Sarah sat back, her chest heaving as though she had been the one to fight. "You said once you could not love me more," she murmured, her eyes on the flicker of firelight from the canyon below. "Do you still believe that?" Kael did not answer at once. He lifted his face to the sky, where the clouds still drifted in torn shreds. The lightning was gone, but the stars had returned cold, sharp, eternal. Finally, his voice came, low and rough. "Love makes men weak, and weakness kills." Sarah's throat tightened. The words hurt more than the storm, more than the sight of blood. Yet she could not stop herself. "And what of strength?" she whispered. "What of the strength it takes to hold on to someone, to not let the world take everything?" Kael turned his head, his eyes finding hers. For the first time, the warrior mask slipped, if only a little. His gaze held both pain and hunger, something he had denied for too long. "You do not know what you ask," he said. Almost broken. Sarah leaned closer, her voice trembling but steady enough to reach him. "Then teach me." The silence that followed was deeper than the storm had been. Only the crackle of fire in the distance, the restless stamping of the stallion nearby, and the faint hiss of dripping water filled the air. Kael's breath was heavy, his body taut as though every fiber warred with itself. At last, his hand rose. Slow, hesitant, as though touching her might burn him. He brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers lingering longer than he intended. Sarah closed her eyes, her breath shuddering. For a moment, Kael allowed himself to feel, not as a warrior, not as a legend, but as a man. The storm had raged, the enemies had fallen, and yet this moment felt more dangerous than all of it, because it was not death he feared, it was love. The first rays of dawn touched the canyon like hesitant fingers, painting the jagged cliffs in shades of rose and gold. Smoke drifted upward from the remnants of torches and battle fires, thin trails winding into the softening sky. The world seemed caught between ruin and rebirth. Kael stirred beneath the rocky overhang, his dark eyes opening to the hush of morning. The ache in his side burned, but it was nothing compared to the war still raging inside him. The storm had passed, yet its echo lingered in his chest. He shifted, and Sarah's head lifted from where it had rested lightly against his shoulder. "You should have slept longer," she said softly, her voice still raw from the night. Kael studied her in the gentle light. Her hair, tangled and damp, caught the sunrise like strands of fire. The bruises of exhaustion lined her face, but there was something unbroken in her gaze. She was not born to this land, yet she carried its strength as though it had chosen her. "You should not have stayed," he replied, his voice low and graveled. "You have seen what follows me." Sarah's lips parted, but she did not look away. "I've seen what you are. That's why I stayed." Her words struck him harder than any spear. Kael's jaw tightened as he looked past her, toward the canyon floor littered with silence. The outcasts had fled before the dawn, their torches abandoned, their cries lost to the storm. The land was scarred, but it was his still for now. "You think love is weakness," Sarah continued, rising to her knees. The shawl she had torn for bandages hung in tatters, but she wrapped what remained around her shoulders. "But I think the opposite. I think it is the only thing strong enough to survive all this." Kael's eyes returned to her, sharp as a hawk's, yet shadowed with something deeper. He had fought wars, carried scars, seen men betray and tribes fall. Love was a battlefield he had never dared to enter. But Sarah's words, her hands on his wound, her presence in the storm, they had cut deeper than any blade. "Love is fire," he said finally. "It burns. It consumes. And when the flames die, there is only ash." Sarah reached out, her fingers trembling, but she did not hesitate. She touched his hand, rough and calloused, resting it against her chest where her heartbeat thudded steady and real. "Or," she whispered, "it warms. It gives light. And when morning comes, there is still something left, something worth holding on to." For the first time in years, Kael had no answer. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of all he could not say. The canyon wind stirred his long black hair, tugging at the feathers of his tribal jewelry. His muscles, scarred and strong, were taut as if bracing for another blow, but none came. Only the soft rhythm of Sarah's breath, the unyielding truth in her eyes. Slowly, Kael lifted his hand to her face, tracing the line of her jaw with rough tenderness. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. The warrior who had faced storms, who had stood against fire and death, finally let the walls within him tremble. When Sarah's lips brushed his, it was not a conquest. It was a surrender neither of them had expected, but both had needed. The dawn grew brighter, washing the canyon in light. The land bore its scars, yet it lived. "So did they?" Kael pulled back, searching her eyes, and for once did not hide the conflict within him. "If I choose this," he said quietly, "there is no turning back. The world will not forgive it. My people may never forgive it." Sarah's voice was steady, though her eyes glistened. "Then let the world rage. We survived the storm. We can survive anything." Kael's chest rose and fell, his breath thick with the weight of a decision years in the making. At last he bowed his head slightly, his forehead touching hers. "Then we stand together," he whispered. The morning wind swept through the canyon, carrying away the smoke, the ashes, the remnants of the night. What remained was something fragile yet unbroken, a promise carved not in stone but in flesh and fire. And as the sun climbed higher, Kael realized that love had not weakened him. It had remade him.